to the DNA stuff, which is really what I want to do today, to give another approach that you might want to take specifically about this isolation issue. Because first of all, the isolation issue is everything. If you haven't isolated, that is to say, have the thing you're looking for in a pure form, then hopefully everybody, at least everybody who's willing to think, would agree that you can't do any studies of something that you don't have in a pure form. You can't say this part came from this thing unless you have the thing first. You can't say this thing does such and such unless you have isolated the thing from all other things and therefore have the means, the possibility of studying it. And one of the ways you can bring that point home is by using analogies, which is what I tend to do a lot of. And I'm sure you can think of them. For instance, you can't know if there's a hammer in your toolbox and what it does and what it's made of, unless you take the hammer out of the toolbox and you have only the hammer, and then you can analyze what the hammer is made of and see if that hammer and the hammer alone knocks in the nail. Nobody would say that it's a proof if you ground up the entire toolbox and see what that's made of, or hit the nail with the entire toolbox to prove that hammers knock in nails. So the way I would start this conversation with any of the pro-virus people is to say, because the virus issue is so charged, let's just discuss how we isolate something else. So you could start with the hammer, and then you could go to the frog. And everybody knows you'd go to a pond where you suspect there is this organism called a frog. You would look for the frog. If you see something that meets the definition of a frog, you would take that, isolate it, means separate it from all other things, and then you could see what the frog does, if the frog catches flies, etc. If you're a mean person, you could actually kill the frog and dissect it and see what it's made of. And you could go through many, many examples of how that is exactly how we human beings study just about anything. Nobody would say that the definition of isolation of a frog would be to go to a pond and then dump a whole lot of ocean water and a whole lot of fresh water and a whole lot of tap water into the pond, sprinkle some algae and some fish in there, and then take a scoop and put that in a vat of flies and see if the flies die. And if the flies die, that means there's frogs that are eating flies. But I would actually put that example to any of the virus people and see if they agree that that is how you would isolate a frog. And maybe they'd say yes. And then I would say, but isn't that essentially exactly how they, quote, isolate the virus? They took unpurified pond water, otherwise known as bronchial fluid, mixed it with some other things, put it on something, see an effect, and call that isolation. Isn't that exactly what we just did with the frog? And yet, for some reason, nobody, I don't think, would say that that first example is how you isolate a frog. So why would you say this is how you isolate a virus? And see what they say. And go through example after example and finish with the question of, why is this the only thing I can think of? Because this happens, you could do this with nanoparticles. So this is not a size issue. I've talked to analytical chemists, and they have their techniques for separating out a nanoparticle from all the other things. They have it in a pure form. They then can assess what it's made of and what it does, if it does anything. So that process is obviously intuitive, logical, rational. It meets the criteria for scientific accuracy. Why is there one exception, which is this virus exception, that we have an entirely different process that we somehow also call isolation? So that's how I would proceed with the conversation. And what you have to do then is get very good, and this isn't easy for most people, is not moving off that topic or that example until you get agreement. And so if there is no agreement, then just go to another similar example, and I'm sure you could think of hundreds, and go through one after another, essentially wearing them down to say, isn't this what we mean by isolation? And isn't this not what we mean by isolation? And why, when we look at what you're claiming as isolation, we're doing exactly what you would say is not isolation? Why is there an example in this case? And they can give whatever excuse they want, but frankly, there is no excuse, because that is not how any rational, logical, sane person would think. So I hope that helps.